It is Al-Qaeda's first strike at America. Hundreds are killed by suicide bombs at 2 US embassies in Africa.
The scale of the bombing was enormous.
It is the beginning of a new era of terrorism.
You can't really overstate the impact. This was the declaration of war on the United States.
For the CIA, there's only one man who can hunt down the killers. The legendary operative, John Bennett.
He is entrepreneurial, aggressive. He is exactly the sort of person in a war zone that you would want in charge.
The terrorists are operating from a country that's a no-go zone for the US.
It was very dangerous. These Somali clans will turn you over for a few dollars.
The top-secret mission? Infiltrate the most dangerous country in the world, deliver Operation Celestial Balance, and work with SEAL Team 6 to ensure that justice is done. It's a bustling August morning in Nairobi, the capital of the East African state of Kenya. If it's famous for anything, it's for its world-class safari parks and pristine beaches. It's a part of Africa that doesn't often make the news headlines. Just after 10:30 a.m., a truck drives up to the US Embassy. And instead of slowing at the barrier, it accelerates.
The scale of the bombing was enormous. It was not only the explosive capacity which destroyed the embassy and nearby buildings, but the shockwave shattered glass for many, many blocks around. Most of the Kenyans who were injured badly were hit by flying glass.
The final death toll is 12 Americans and 200 Kenyans, with over 4,000 injured. Almost simultaneously, another suicide bomb explodes outside the US Embassy in Dar es Salaam, the capital of the neighboring country of Tanzania. Nothing has ever happened like this before to Americans in the region. It's an incomprehensible act that stuns the world.
Our teams are on the ground in Africa. They are tending to the wounded. They are providing security. They are searching and finding evidence. We will do whatever we can to bring the murderers to justice.
To a handful of experts inside America's intelligence and security agencies, it's immediately obvious that the sophistication of an operation like this can't have come from locals working alone. The suspicion is that a Saudi prince few have heard of, called Osama Bin Laden, is behind the attacks. Earlier in the year, he declared a holy war on the US. And now it's clear he wants the world to know that America has an implacable enemy that will strike without warning.
The 1998 embassy bombings were a turning point. Until then, Al-Qaeda had been a shadowy, behind-the-scenes presence. It wasn't really known to the public, wasn't widely known outside intelligence circles. You can't really overstate the impact. This was the declaration of war on the United States.
The only explanation for the location of the attacks is the ease with which they can be carried out. Poor security, corruption, and easy targets like Western mass tourism make the country irresistible to a burgeoning terror organization.
The embassy bombing revealed the fact that the East Africa Al-Qaeda cell found Kenya to be actually quite a permissive environment to work in. They had both aggrieved Muslim coastal populations that they could find some support from. They had opportunities, thanks to Kenya's corrupt political system and police, to operate with near impunity, and they had thousands of soft targets.
Almost immediately, the US hits back at known Al-Qaeda targets.
Today, I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan.
But they fail to achieve their objectives. The strikes on a base in Sudan destroy a harmless pharmaceutical factory. 75 missiles hit 4 Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan in an attempt to kill Osama Bin Laden. But he's not in any of them. As well as tracking down Osama bin Laden, the CIA wants the local cell responsible for the planning and the execution of the attacks. Within hours of the bombing, Kenyan police have an amazing stroke of luck. They arrest a man who turns out to be one of the suicide bombers, who panicked and fled at the last minute. On his cell phone are numbers that confirm his links to Al-Qaeda. But he gives an even more valuable piece of information: the name of his Al-Qaeda handler in Nairobi. That name is Harun Fazul. The CIA Nairobi station immediately get to work. They check NSA wiretaps of Osama bin Laden's calls to Nairobi and see regular connections to the offices of an aid charity and conversations with an employee there called Fazul. When investigators raid the charity's offices, they discover fake passports that show that Harun Fazul is an alias used by someone called Fazul Abdullah Mohammed. It turns out he's a hardened terrorist with over a decade's experience.
Fazul had a very long and winding background, but he moved to several different places, in and out of Africa, even going as far as going to Pakistan. He was the personal secretary to Osama bin Laden, and then moved with bin Laden back to Sudan. Fazul really became one of the guys that was a foreign operations director, took on this role of doing the big external foreign attacks for Al-Qaeda, and specifically the Horn of Africa. He would make trips into Kenya, and so leading up to the embassy bombings, he would go there, set up logistics, look at financing and money.
Investigators also discover that Fazul is assisted by a young protege called Saleh Ali Nabhan. Further interrogations reveal that the two terrorists fled Kenya on the eve of the bombing. CIA analysts conclude they must have gone to one particular country. Kenya's violent, lawless, and chaotic neighbor, Somalia, is the perfect safe haven for terrorists on the run. For years, it's been a no-go area for Americans, thanks to the notorious Battle of Mogadishu 5 years earlier. The shooting down of a Black Hawk helicopter and the drawn-out rescue attempt that followed led to massive American casualties. It later became known as Black Hawk Down.
18 U.S. Army Rangers were killed. Hundreds of Somalis died in that. The U.S. pulled out, and Somalia was left to its own devices for a number of years.
The CIA now realizes that going after Fazul and Nabhan means chasing them down to the one place where no commander wants to send his men. Somalia is a dead zone, where the US has no base, no friends, and no contacts.
The assets that the US intelligence community had in Somalia were practically non-existent. When the US troops pulled out of Mogadishu in 1993, the CIA station went with them. That was the last CIA presence in the country.
The CIA is virtually in the dark and will need to build an intelligence gathering operation from the ground up.
Very difficult to go in there and really get any sort of intelligence going. There's not a lot of signals intelligence, so you really have to rely on human intelligence.
And then the CIA makes another disturbing discovery. Because Kenya's Muslims distrust the US-backed Christian government, Al-Qaeda sympathizers straddle the border of Kenya and Somalia. It's a situation which suits the terrorists perfectly.
The internal dynamics of Kenya really play to the strengths of guys like Fazul and Nabhan. So we partner with the Kenyan government, which is predominantly Christian and from the tribes of central Kenya, but the Kenyan Muslim coast has always been a minority and a somewhat oppressed minority. And because there is that division in that country, Nabhan and Fazul can move up and down the coast of Kenya and in these Muslim populations.
Intelligence comes in that Fazul and Nabhan are most likely being protected by a Muslim fishing community on one of the many islands that dot the coast of Kenya.
Fazul built networks both in Nairobi, especially in a neighborhood known as Eastleigh, which is a slum area of Nairobi, and he also did that up and down the coast of Kenya. He would move up and down through those locations and then move back into Somalia, and even there he would pick up Kenyans who he would train in Somalia, and they would move back into Kenya. That knew how to sort of naturally navigate these networks, I think, and it gave them a certain ability to move up and down the coast, where once it came time to execute an attack, they knew exactly how to do it, and they had a robust network to do that.
Posing as fishermen and married into local families, the cell now starts making inroads into the ports of Somalia, building logistics and networks to enable their next attack.
It turned out that the East Africa Al-Qaeda cell was using Somalia the same way a lot of business people were using Somalia, basically as the world's largest duty-free shop. The ports there, the seaports where you could move money men, materiel from beach to truck and into East Africa, no questions asked.
The cell now have a presence in both countries and are able to switch at a moment's notice when it suits them, maximizing the proximity of a failed state to a land effectively defenseless from terrorism.
What's different about Kenya as well as opposed to Somalia, especially for Al-Qaeda, is access to Western targets. To attack a Westerner from Somalia, they have to project a long way. They have to really build out an operation. You can't do that unless you have a support network in another country with access to targets. They could access Western targets there. They had a network that could support them, and they had a safe haven in Somalia that they could flee to. So Kenya became a right place for Fazul and Nabhan to essentially conduct attacks on the West.
The CIA know that with all its resources and power, the US could send in troops and bring the terrorists to justice. But since the disaster of Black Hawk Down, nobody in Washington has much interest in tackling Somalia. Then one day in September 2001, all that changes.
and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
9/11 suddenly put Somalia on the front burner of U.S. counterterrorism concerns. The U.S. government had very good reason to believe that as it hit Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda would disperse to ungoverned space, places where it would be beyond the reach of rule of law. And Somalia, of course, is a country with a completely collapsed state, an Islamic country. And so Somalia immediately garnered a lot of attention.
With an overnight change in policy towards the terror threat in Africa, the hunt for the masterminds behind the embassy bombings now becomes a top priority. The US is now determined to prevent Somalia becoming a haven for Al-Qaeda. And President Bush allocates $100 million of military spending to the region. At the center of the package is an expanded military base on Somalia's northern border and a massive investment in the CIA operation in Kenya with a substantial influx of intelligence operatives and special forces.
So the CIA station in Nairobi was dramatically reinforced. We brought in a bunch of military guys. You know, the cover was they were part of a training mission for the Kenyan military. And in fact, they were all special forces operators with some paramilitary experience with the CIA. And these guys became the nucleus for trying to figure out what was going on inside Somalia.
But all the spending in the world won't give the CIA the one thing they need most: intelligence on the location of Fazul and Nabhan. They need contacts in Somalia, and despite the increased investment, a year on from 9/11, the trail is still ice cold. Kenyan intelligence and CIA analysts realize that they have no means of guessing where or when the terrorists might strike next. All they can be certain of is, it's only a matter of time before they do. One of the jewels of Kenya's tourist industry is its tropical coastline. And a much sought-after beach resort is the Paradise Hotel, near the busy port of Mombasa. It's popular with Israelis flying in from Tel Aviv for a week in the sun. It's the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Everyone is in festive mood. Suddenly, a car explodes outside the hotel. 16 people are killed, including 10 Kenyans and 3 Israelis. Many more are injured. A mile away at the same time, a chartered passenger flight from Mombasa to Israel takes off carrying 200 holidaymakers heading home. As it leaves the tarmac, 2 surface-to-air missiles streak towards the plane. The missiles only just miss their target. Simultaneous, coordinated attacks, the Al-Qaeda signature. Just like the twin bombings of the US embassies 4 years earlier.
They do a 2-prong attack. The first group is 2 suicide bombers that go to the Paradise Hotel, but Nabhan takes on the role of leading this sort of effort at the Mombasa airport. Nabhan actually is the one who fires one of the missiles at the jet. Luckily, neither of the missiles actually hit the jet, but Nabhan sort of led that cell, and with that, he rejoins with the others. They move back to Somalia. And that was really the last time they were at least working in terms of operations there.
For the CIA, an awful reality is dawning. Despite the massive investment in counterterrorism since 9/11, the bombers have struck again, just a few hundred miles from their last attack, in an operation that could have been even more deadly. American and Kenyan agents now realize Al-Qaeda is accelerating its attacks on Western targets. And the CIA will now more than ever need to hunt them down. It's a wake-up call for anyone who thought that the war on terror was going America's way in East Africa. Fazul and Nabhan now base themselves permanently in Somalia, but have a network of operatives who they can use to plan an ambitious series of attacks on Western hotels in Kenya.
One of the low-level operatives that was arrested in Mombasa said that after the Paradise Hotel attacks, he was told to start casing hotels around Mombasa. And Fazul specifically told him to go around those hotels in Mombasa, and that the plan was essentially later on to come back and do another hotel-style attack. But he was seen again, a couple different times on the Kenyan coast coming back down. And what you have to wonder is, was he doing reconnaissance essentially to conduct another attack in Kenya?
And then there's a breakthrough. Satellite phone intercepts reveal a dramatic increase in Al-Qaeda-related activity in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. It suggests that this must be the terrorist cell's base of operations.
The East Africa Al-Qaeda cell started coming and going from Mogadishu back to Kenya. We're talking about a small number of what the US government called high-value targets, maybe 5 people. And that meant that the US now had specific targets of interest in Mogadishu that it was going to try to pursue.
The problem the CIA faces is that they need a presence on the ground in Mogadishu. But that simply isn't possible. Somalia is completely lawless. The US military were driven out 5 years earlier. It's anarchy in which outsiders don't stand a chance. Then critically important information comes to light. Buoyed by their successful attacks in Kenya, the terrorists Fazul and Nabhan have become confident and are starting to raise their profile. It allows the CIA to start picking up their trail. They are forging links with local Somali extremists who are now offering them protection. For the CIA, it's a game changer.
It became increasingly clear that the Al-Qaeda East Africa network had local allies in Somalia, that it was protected by some militias. At that time, they had no name. Their leadership was still unknown, but that there was a nexus in Somalia between Al-Qaeda East Africa and local extremists. And from that point onwards, American counterterrorism efforts really started to focus on the Al-Qaeda leadership in Somalia and their local associates.
The CIA realized that with Al-Qaeda building its presence in Somalia's capital, they have to think the unthinkable. They will have to send agents in a covert operation to the most dangerous place in all Africa for Americans. They turn to the only man who can make that happen. A legendary operative steeped in years of top-secret missions in Africa. Famous for taking extreme risks and getting results in his pursuit of targets. His name is John Bennett.
John Bennett was pretty good at his job. He is entrepreneurial, he is aggressive, he is exactly the sort of person in a war zone that you would want in charge of your operation. He's not afraid to take risks. in an intelligence community that was criticized after 9/11 for being risk adverse. He was the exact opposite.
Bennett is under no illusions about what he faces. He knows that the kind of intelligence network the CIA must build will only be done by experts with years of experience in Africa. And even then, it's a massive task.
Building an intelligence network under those sorts of conditions is extremely, extremely difficult. The other thing that's unique about Somalia, there are lots of foreign cultures that, don't like outsiders. This is very common in places where Al-Qaeda hides, but in Somalia, maybe more than anywhere else, they don't trust foreigners. It's a very clan-based society, and because of that clan basis, how do you essentially build intelligence inside a clan that you have no access to and almost no contact with?
Operating out of the CIA station in Nairobi, Bennett now uses his years of experience working with African guerrilla armies and rebel militias to make a plan to infiltrate Mogadishu. He knows that not everyone in the capital is friendly to Al-Qaeda and the Somali extremists protecting them. If he can make an alliance with their enemies, he might be able to persuade them to help the US. But that means dealing with some of the most dangerous men in Africa. The notorious Somali warlords. Bennett now sends in his best operatives, carrying huge quantities of cash.
The U.S. strategy to apprehend these high-value targets who were coming and going from Mogadishu was to outsource it. The U.S. government turned to the dance partners who were available at the time, a group of clan militia leaders, and in some cases some business leaders with large private militia to guard their properties, and paid them to try to apprehend these East Africa Al-Qaeda cell individuals.
Bennett knows that the one thing that will win over the warlords is old-fashioned bribery. In Mogadishu, more than anywhere else, money talks. His strategy is simple. Cold, hard cash for the people and the intelligence he needs. The better the people, and the more useful the intelligence, the bigger the payoff. In a world where anyone will turn over anyone else for the right price, whoever has the most dollars calls the shots.
It was very dangerous work. The Somali clans will turn you over for a few dollars just as easily as they will to cooperate with you. So Americans operating in that part of the country with these clan leaders, basically, you really took your life in your hands. Whatever access we thought we could get away with, we did. But we had no embassy, no diplomatic cover, no protection under international law if our personnel got caught. It was very dangerous work.
Bennett's gamble with the warlords seems to work. Gradually, they start seizing suspects and turn them over to the CIA.
Some of these figures were engaged then in trying to identify, to track down Al-Qaeda leadership. And there began a process of apprehension of some of the suspects and rendition of some of the suspects.
The only trouble is none of them are the Al-Qaeda bombers Fazul or Nabhan. But if Bennett can't get the people he wants, at least the new alliances with the warlords means he can put in a second line of attack. He turns to a top-secret unit in the CIA, purpose-built for penetrating the toughest environments in covert operations and delivering targets and intelligence. The Special Activities Division. They work with signals specialists called the Intelligence Support Activity. Under the protection of the warlords, they can operate right on Al-Qaeda's doorstep in the Somali capital. They have years of experience tracking insurgents in Afghanistan and are experts in building networks of local agents and informants. They start tapping the cell phone traffic of Mogadishu's terror groups, hunting for clues on the whereabouts of Fazul and Nabhan. And then Bennett deploys a third strategy. Somalia's roads are full of trucks carrying freight across the borders into Kenya and Ethiopia. Drivers and traders travel widely in the country, and for the right price, will act as spies. Almost immediately, Bennett's various intelligence strategies deliver a result. Multiple sources confirm the existence of a new Al-Qaeda cell run by Nabhan and a well-advanced plot with the potential for massive casualties. Nabhan is planning to charter a plane and crash it into the US Embassy in Nairobi. 2 truck bombs will explode simultaneously at the gates of the newly rebuilt compound. All flights between Somalia and Kenya are immediately suspended and the embassy is evacuated. The plot is foiled, but it shows the CIA that Al-Qaeda is maturing into a determined and well-resourced operation, and its protection in Mogadishu is making it stronger every day. The strategy of CIA boss John Bennett should be yielding suspects and getting investigators closer to the terrorists. But it hits a problem. As the months pass, it's clear that the warlords are taking the CIA's money, but mostly delivering excuses.
The individuals and the clans that they contracted with were not the same sub-clans that were hosting the high-value targets. And so they had great difficulty even moving into, much less reaching into and getting information on those neighborhoods. Secondly, these militia leaders weren't necessarily very interested in the risk involved in going into a safe house and grabbing some very valuable Al-Qaeda suspects at the expense of a rival clan, because it could trigger an entire clan war.
It now looks like John Bennett is not getting value for money, and the warlords are treating the Americans with contempt. They know they hold all the cards, and the CIA have no one else to turn to in order to get the people and information they need.
Over time, they were very happy to take the money from the US government, but weren't particularly engaged in apprehending these individuals, and that led to some growing frustration within the US government.
And then there's a new problem. Bennett finds out that the warlords are now faking information and arresting innocent people just to keep the money rolling in. It's looking more and more like the cash payments are turning counter-terrorism intelligence into a business on the streets of Mogadishu.
There were so many people involved, trading on information, selling intelligence, fabricating intelligence, arresting people on speculation that maybe this would be someone the US government would either pay money for or would have an interest in. The apprehension of Al-Qaeda suspects was deeply unpopular because warlords were not necessarily discriminating in who they arrested.
Bennett's deals with the warlords are supposed to be a covert operation. But the word is spreading that their clumsy counter-terrorism operations are backed by the CIA. It's making the Americans even more unpopular on the streets of Mogadishu, which plays right into the hands of the extremists.
The involvement of the CIA and possibly other parts of the US government with Somali militia leaders was an open secret. There are very few secrets in Somalia. And some of the warlords who were involved in these operations wanted it to be known that they were friends of the United States and would boast about it. So the nature of US support very quickly became clear that faction leaders were receiving cash payments that they were being given specialized equipment to help them gather intelligence and conduct surveillance on sites they believed were linked with Al-Qaeda.
To complicate matters, Al-Qaeda and their protectors start a pushback against the CIA's bounty hunters, the warlords. Gang warfare erupts on the streets.
You had warlords and militia leaders hunting Al-Qaeda figures and their local Somali affiliates. And on the other hand, the Somali militias associated with Al-Qaeda were starting to identify who was involved in counterterrorism operations and to target their pursuers. So there were reciprocal assassinations and attacks between members of these groups that started to escalate through 2004, 2005, with what effectively became a kind of dirty war in the streets of Mogadishu.
Then the signals specialists, the intelligence support activity, discover from wiretaps a worrying development. Fazul and Nabhan's extremist Somali protectors are rapidly gaining numbers and strength in the capital.
And it was around 2002, 2004 that we began to see the rise of a small militia, a Sharia court militia that was answering to one of about 14 Sharia courts in Mogadishu, almost none of which were radical. They were traditional, they were governed by traditional Sufi clerics and clan elders, but this one Sharia court had radical elements in it, and that militia came to be known eventually as Shabab. And it included some mujahideen who had been in Afghanistan, and that was the link that the East Africa Al-Qaeda cell was exploiting there.
The terrorists are now protected by thousands of extreme Islamists who are every bit as dangerous as Al-Qaeda, and their main enemy is the warlords working with the CIA. It couldn't be worse news. The CIA is losing its protection in Mogadishu. The balance of power in the city is switching from the warlords to the extremists. And the Americans are on the wrong side. To the operatives on the ground, despite all their efforts, it looks like the CIA will be driven out of Somalia again.
And then something remarkable happened. The Ethiopian armed forces invaded Somalia.
Ethiopia, Somalia's Christian neighbor, is an ally of the US and more alarmed than anyone at the rise of the extremists in Mogadishu.
Ethiopia was not going to tolerate the rise of an extremist Islamist group in Mogadishu. They had to rid themselves of this emerging threat.
Ethiopia sent over 10,000 troops and captured Mogadishu.
Amazingly, the CIA is back in with a chance. It's about the best Christmas present Bennett could have hoped for. When Ethiopia's army sweeps through Somalia, the CIA gets an open invitation to move as close to the action as they want. The CIA and its special forces now use the Ethiopian army to capture militants and start interrogating them. Before long, vital information comes to light. Fresh intelligence indicates that Al-Qaeda has relocated south to the one place they know they can defend. An island called Ras Kamboni.
Ras Kamboni is a name given to both an island and a coastal area right on the Kenya-Somali border. It's very remote. It was a training base, certainly a spot for provisioning. We know that they were coming and going from that area.
There's a functioning fishing business there, and they actually mention this in their documents, and they say, we have access to the port, it's good for trafficking and moving people, weapons, money, whatever it might be, and it's close to Kenya, it's only a few kilometers away.
Strategically, Ras Kamboni couldn't be a better base. It's protected by swamps inland and is very hard to attack in a ground or sea assault. Analysts believe Fazul and Nabhan are hiding out here. This is the opportunity the CIA has been waiting for. When the Ethiopian army besieges the town, AC-130 gunships are sent in to hit the training camps with lethal force. The camps are flattened, but there's no sign of Fazul or Nabhan. Once again, the Al-Qaeda leaders have slipped through the CIA's net. It's getting harder to avoid the conclusion that the only way to take out the terrorists is by putting boots on the ground and sending in special forces. It will mean risking another Black Hawk Down. Back in Mogadishu, an increasingly unstable political situation means the US is running out of time if it wants to find the bombers. Despite the Ethiopian invasion, Al-Shabaab, the extremist protectors of the Al-Qaeda terrorists, Fazul and Nabhan, is rapidly gaining mass popularity.
At this point, in early 2007, Shabaab morphs from a small, committed Islamist militia of about 400 mujahideen to a much larger movement involving thousands of Somalis who are supporting them tactically. They're supporting them to get the Ethiopian invasion out of Somalia. So Shabaab is in a position now where it captures the flag of anti-Ethiopian sentiment, which is fierce in Somalia.
The CIA knows that Shabaab's power means that it will be increasingly hard to seize their allies Fazul and Nabhan. Then the CIA's Special Activities Division uncovers intelligence that the terrorists have hit a problem. A political crisis in Shabaab means they've started to fight amongst themselves. Fazul and Nabhan's protectors are losing their effectiveness. It might just expose the terrorists and give the CIA the chance it so badly needs.
They have internal clan fighting going on within Shabaab. Who's going to be the leader? You know, who's in charge? Is it more about Somali issues, or is it about these foreign fighters that have come in from all over the world?
The quarreling is forcing one of the bombers, the Al-Qaeda leader Saleh Ali Nabhan, to move more frequently to settle disputes and broker deals. This movement makes him an easy target for surveillance. The CIA quickly trace his safe house in the capital and start a round-the-clock watch. They learn that from time to time, Nabhan travels south of the capital, usually in a single vehicle, and he's lightly armed. The CIA puts forward a plan to senior commanders in Washington to take Nabhan in a snatch operation, dead or alive. It's called Operation Celestial Balance. The US Fifth Fleet is directed to wait off the Somali coast. Silent, miniaturized surveillance drones are launched to watch the roads running south out of Mogadishu.
Navy ships carry their own unmanned drones called Scan Eagles, very small drones which you can launch off the helicopter deck on the back of a frigate or a destroyer. And it's wonderful for doing covert surveillance work. It's quiet, we can stay in the air for upwards of 7 or 8 hours.
CIA surveillance teams on the ground in Mogadishu report that Nabhan is on the move. And the alarm goes up in Washington. He'll be on the road for about 4 hours. At the Pentagon and the White House, officials assemble to discuss the options. The target area is out of range from the nearest drone base, which means a hunter-killer drone strike is not an option. A cruise missile attack runs a high risk of missing a vehicle on the move, and an AC-130 gunship can be evaded by such a small group. With the options narrowing fast, senior commanders in the Pentagon have to consider an operation in the most dangerous country in the world for American soldiers. Commanders insist that if men do go in, they must have the advantage of surprise. But Nabhan is traveling through open country. It's the worst environment for an ambush, so precision in locating him is critical.
The raid would never have been launched unless we had really firm evidence of where Nabhan was physically located. There had to be real-time intelligence from drone reconnaissance.
SEAL Team 6, stationed on a nearby Navy destroyer, now receive their orders. The plan is simple. Make an airborne assault. Scan Eagle's surveillance now proves crucial in tracking Nabhan and his men. As they travel out of the capital, a squad of 4 Little Bird helicopters, backed up by 4 Black Hawks, launches from naval vessels just off the Somali coast. With a fix on Nabhan secured, SEAL Team 6 moves in and engages the Al-Qaeda bomber. Killing him. And everyone with him.
It was unmanned drone video coverage that gave the commandos the location of their target and allowed them to do the job.
Nabhan's body is removed for formal identification and burial at sea. But the CIA's work is not quite finished, and the hunt is on for his fellow Al-Qaeda conspirator, Fazul Mohammed. It's not long before he's located and tracked, and killed in a firefight with the Somali National Army. With the 2 most wanted terrorists in Africa out of action, justice is done for the victims in the US Embassy bombings. It marks a successful conclusion to Operation Celestial Balance and the removal of a major terrorist threat in East Africa. Somalia is closed down as Osama Bin Laden's next refuge. The bombing of the USS Cole. It is one of the first of a series of deadly strikes by Al-Qaeda on US targets.
We had to avenge the 17 souls that perished in the USS Cole.
The organization responsible is quickly identified.
The only people out there who had anywhere close to this capability was Al-Qaeda.
But it'll take the best to find and stop the killers themselves.
We want to know their tactics, their techniques, their procedures, who's involved.
This is the top-secret story of how the CIA used cutting-edge technology in one of the most inhospitable regions in the world to hunt down the terrorist mastermind behind the attack on the USS Cole and deliver lethal justice.
Abu Ali was the godfather, the head of the snake that needed to be decapitated.
In a country where it's easy to hide and impossible to search.
Finding a bunch of guys in the most rugged, forbidding territory I've ever seen.
Highly tribal areas, the tribes were armed to the teeth.
Yeah, it's going to be hard.
It's a sultry morning in the port town of Aden, in Yemen, the Arab world's poorest country. Aden's location on the southern tip of the region makes it useful as a refueling point for US vessels starting a tour of duty. From year to year, little happens here to grab the world's attention. Today, the USS Cole, an American warship with 220 sailors on board, has come into Aden to refuel before heading off on a training exercise. It's nearly 11 a.m. The harbor is busy with small boats and skiffs selling everyday wares to the passing fleets. Then one of them approaches the Cole. Its smiling occupants wave at the sailors.
Very early morning on the 12th of October, 2000, I received a telephone call, and it was my good friend and colleague, Special Agent Randy Hughes. And he had told me in a very excited voice, dude, turn on the TV.
This morning, a U.S. destroyer sits crippled in a Yemen harbor.
And there on the screen was breaking news.
Target of a terrorist attack.
A U.S. warship in the port of Aden had experienced an explosion.
It's more than an explosion. A suicide bomb has ripped a 40-foot hole in the hull of the Cole, nearly sinking the ship.
The latest figures are 7 dead, 10 missing, and 38 wounded.
Eventually, the death toll rises to 17, with 39 injured. Back in the US, the families of the dead and injured struggle to make sense of the first attack of its kind in US military history.
If it turns out that this is a terrorist act, as it appears to be, but certainly the investigation will prove that, and any leads on who might have done it will be followed wherever they go.
To most people, this is an incomprehensible crime. But to a small number of experts in the FBI and the CIA, it's got all the hallmarks of a terrorist attack. Prime suspect, Al-Qaeda. And the largely lawless mountains and deserts of Yemen is one of its favorite hiding places. With alarm bells ringing across the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, the Naval Criminal Investigation Service, and the military send in plane loads of their best teams. Special Agent Bob McFadden is a seasoned operator in the Middle East with long stints of service in Bahrain and a command of fluent Arabic. He's summoned to Yemen to join a task force of investigators.
The word was to pack my bags for about 10 days, and 10 days wound up being the better part of 2 years.
And they have just one mission objective: find the killers of America's 17 sailors and bring them to justice.
Words fail us, but our feelings are pure.
And only now can all the details of that extraordinary mission be told. For it would be a mission that would test the CIA to its limits and involve every counterterrorism agency in the US.
I get word that some of the US government support elements are starting to come into Aden. So I go down to Aden Airport to meet what I think is a relatively small group of people. And there's about 7 US government planes of different varieties that had landed at the airport, and I didn't know they were coming in. The Yemenis didn't know they were coming in. No one had told the Yemenis that what looked like a small invasion force was going to be coming in. At its height, we were somewhere around 350 people.
When investigators arrive, the USS Cole is listing heavily. And they have to move fast to gather what evidence they can from the stricken vessel before it sinks.
Seeing the news clips of the ship is one thing, but then actually seeing it and being aboard the ship is another altogether. Very emotional, visceral. The sights, the sounds, the smells of destruction and decay is just remarkable.
It looked like a wounded animal. There was something horrific about a ship that mortally wounded and yet still somehow struggling to stay afloat. It should have sunk. It didn't.
Aden's local police start mass arrests, seizing anyone they suspect. And from eyewitness evidence, very quickly figure out the basics of how the operation was carried out.
They were able to identify the launching spot of the skiff that attacked the ship. They were able to identify very early on the compound where the bomb in the skiff had been assembled. So they were able to do a lot of those basics pretty quickly.
Now, hundreds of US detectives from the CIA, the FBI, and the Naval Criminal Investigation Service get to work with ferocious energy.
It truly was a 24-hour operation, and it was an exceptional working element among all those different agencies. There's so much to do, so many tasks to take care of. Setting up the communications and technicians, setting up comms, secure comms with Washington, getting facsimiles up, getting internet connectivity for unclass and then various levels of classified systems.
The army of investigators is led by an extraordinary boss who commands fierce loyalty among his team. John O'Neill, one of America's top experts on a terrorist who few at this point have heard of, called Osama Bin Laden, and the shadowy group he commands called Al-Qaeda. O'Neill leads his massive team from the front, working tirelessly to deliver results.
Bigger-than-life personality, very confident, articulate, very personable, very, very quick on his feet, and truly someone who has a natural multitasking capability.
Gathered around O'Neill is a team of the best intelligence officers in the US. And leading them is a Lebanese PhD called Ali Soufan, one of the few investigators who speaks fluent Arabic.
Ali Soufan is someone with Arabic skills. You know, not just with language, but a lot of the unspoken things, a lot of the cultural things that might not go into a bureaucratic report, but that make a lot of difference in building personal relationships.
The CIA believe that the men they want are Al-Qaeda. But finding the individuals in Yemen who carried out the crime seems an enormous challenge at this stage. All they have is scraps of evidence and eyewitness testimony. Then, Soufan and McFadden make a connection with another terrorist crime 2 years earlier in the East African country of Kenya. There, 2 simultaneous attacks on US embassies in 1998 killed over 200 people and wounded 4,000.
As President Clinton has indicated, we're going to conduct an intensive, unending, and unyielding investigation to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Now FBI and CIA operatives from the East Africa investigation are sent in to help O'Neill and the US team in Yemen. They bring expertise that confirms beyond doubt the coal was bombed by Al-Qaeda.
Very experienced investigators, special agents, detectives came to Yemen with a deep experience and knowledge of Al-Qaeda and its modus operandi, how it put together the cell for East Africa, what kind of tactics they used, what kind of safe houses they rented, how they went about getting the explosives.
The East Africa team points out similarities in bomb-making techniques, planning methods, concealment strategies and team structures between the embassy bombings they've been investigating and the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen.
You have a core element that we're saying over and over again, remarkable similarities to how the East Africa dual attacks occurred.
And sure enough, when names surfacing in connection with the USS Cole attack are shown to investigators with knowledge of the East African embassy bombings, matches are made.
Some of the same names that were involved in East Africa, facilitators and others that were at large, their names were coming up very early on in the Cole investigation.
There's now no doubt left in the minds of the investigators. It has to be Al-Qaeda. What they need is the local cell, the Yemenis who set up and carried out the attack on the ship. And then there's a breakthrough. Yemeni police recover a hat from the site of the explosion.
The Yemenis were able to find a cap from one of the bombers that had some hair, that had some DNA. Pretty soon, we had a pretty good idea of who was responsible for setting up this attack.
With the DNA evidence, the name of one of the suicide bombers is confirmed. And from that, a network of local associations emerges. Suspected members of the Al-Qaeda cell in Yemen are brought in and interrogated. Soufan and McFadden interview two men who turn out to be junior operators in the attack. It looks like the investigation is on a roll. And from these two men, the US teams extract the name of the organizer, the leader of the cell. He's not a Yemeni. He's a wealthy young Saudi who is constantly on the move around Africa and the Middle East. His name is Abdul Nashri. With this vital piece of new information, the investigators are ready to close in and shut down the cell that killed the 17 US sailors. Justice seems within reach. But then, there's a problem. To get Abdul Nashri, investigators know they are entirely dependent on the cooperation of the Yemeni authorities. But soon, Yemeni officials begin to put up obstacles.
There was a decision somewhere within the chain of command of Yemeni authorities that put a halt to the interview of the witnesses. It was probably not for at least 2 weeks until myself and investigator counterparts were able to re-interview witnesses that the Yemeni investigators had already interviewed.
The cooperative attitude of the Yemen government is rapidly evaporating. And then the US team loses its charismatic leader. The frustrated John O'Neill is called back to the US and then leaves the FBI to take up a new job as head of security at the World Trade Center. It's been 33 days since the attack on the Cole. And the US team is confronted with some devastating intelligence. Cell phone intercepts by CIA analysts indicate that Nashri has set into motion another attack. This time, his target is the investigators themselves.
I received a call from the NCIS Multiple Threat Alert Center and said, "You need to stand by. There's some very significant threat reporting coming in." This was actually a cell coming a-gunning for the investigative element led and directed by Abdurrahim Nashri. A decision was made very, very quickly to pare down the investigative element to a core of 50.
Orders come from Washington for the whole investigative force to pull out of Yemen, and a small core team is evacuated to a warship moored far out at sea. From there, the team learns further details of the planned assault.
There was consistent reporting that there was a cell or cells that would try to conduct some kind of breaching operation where the U.S. element was.
Sure enough, the method of the terrorists mirrors exactly that of the bombers of the East Africa embassies 2 years earlier.
There is a main vehicle with high explosives that is essentially the ramming vehicle, improvised explosive device that breaches the perimeter, and then there are other vehicles with attackers with weapons, RPGs, explosives, just trying to shoot and kill anybody in sight.
But to stand any chance of catching the bombers, the investigation has to be brought back from the warship to Yemen. And with massively increased security, the team returns to Aden.
The investigation had to go on. Very smart people made a decision that our security and other safeguards and measures were in place. And so, quite fortunately, we were able to continue and still restart the investigation.
Soufan and McFadden know that to get the quality of intelligence they need, only meticulous preparation and careful psychology will work.
The way we approach interview and interrogation is a rapport, a relationship-based approach, a cerebral approach, and that starts with getting any and all information available from any source about the subject of the interview. And going in with a plan, but also being able to turn on the dime if our plan's not going as anticipated. Does it mean he's going to say, "You have me, here's everything"? But no, think of it in terms of, say, a helicopter making concentric circles around a target. And you tend to revisit these topics when he's comfortable. And then us establishing up front that we know an awful lot of information about him.
In a classic maneuver of interrogation psychology, the investigators develop sincere relationships with their interviewees, who soon have to reciprocate to preserve their self-respect. And with that come the first pieces of reliable intelligence.
He doesn't want to lose face by continually lying or deceiving, so he's going to have to give up bits of information so he can at least stay somewhere within his circle of comfort. And so working on that at a consistent, professional, and cerebral basis with him day in and day out. Within the first week, we had already opened up a channel of highly reportable and actionable information about the Al-Qaeda structure, its command structure, its communication methodology, its capability and different weapon systems.
And then there's a breakthrough, and the Americans make a discovery that has massive implications for the investigation. They find out that the attack on the Cole was not the first Al-Qaeda attempt to blow up a US naval warship in 2000. 9 months earlier, just days after the Millennium New Year's Eve, an identical plot almost succeeded against another US naval vessel, the USS The Sullivans, but the operation was abandoned when the attack boat flooded by accident. Until now, investigators believe that the mastermind of the Cole bombing was a Saudi called Abdul Nashri, operating with just a tiny group of extremists. The additional intelligence connecting a second plot to attack a US ship points to the presence of a larger cell in Yemen, one that would require a Yemeni leader. Further interrogations yield a new name.
Well, Abu Ali al-Harithi was the godfather for Al-Qaeda in Yemen, or the Emir of the Yemeni branch of Al-Qaeda. So he was the head of the snake that needed to be decapitated.
Abu Ali al-Harithi is even more dangerous and determined than Abdul Nashri, and has a long history of terror operations all over the world.
He's one of what we would call sort of the first generation of jihadis. He fought in Afghanistan in the late 1980s. He was close to Osama bin Laden, building up camps within Yemen, as well as the fact that he had military training. So this is an individual who is able to combine a lot of different skills.
As they find out more about him, the US investigators realize that if nailing Nashri was going to be hard, tackling Harithi will be far more difficult. A hardened survivor with deep roots in Yemen society, he has the protection of a fierce and heavily armed tribe in a remote part of the country. McFadden and Soufan realize that to get al-Harithi, they are going to have to penetrate Yemen's badlands. Wild places where even Yemen's army daren't go.
Yemen is a very mountainous country with expansive areas where the government is not present. That rugged terrain makes it very difficult to establish control. It's very similar to the situation in Afghanistan. The tribes are extremely strong.
CIA investigators know that with the help of special forces and airstrikes, hunting Harati down might be possible. But Yemen's president has forbidden the US military and the CIA from going outside the country's major cities. And he's unwilling to risk a confrontation with the tribes by sending in his own troops. Al-Harati is not only beyond the reach of the US investigators, but the Yemen government forces as well. As a compromise, President Saleh suggests a diplomatic solution to tackle Al-Harati. And reluctantly, the Americans agree.
He went into endless negotiations with Abu Ali directly, trying to get Abu Ali to surrender himself with some guarantees that he wouldn't be handed over to the Americans. But it seemed to us pretty clear that these negotiations were a sham, that Abu Ali never really intended to do so.
As the investigation drags on into 2001, it's obvious the bombers of the USS Cole have disappeared into the sands of Yemen's deserts and mountains, and the investigation is going nowhere. Then one day in September changes everything.
I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
In Yemen, McFadden and Soufan are working the phones, trying to get any information they can on the whereabouts of friends and relatives, and become increasingly concerned about the one man who knew all about Al-Qaeda from the start. Their former boss and mentor, John O'Neill, now head of security at the World Trade Center, and only 11 days into his new job. When they have a routine meeting with a senior Yemeni official, they break the news that they believe their former boss has been murdered by the very people he was sent to Yemen to track down.
We told him that his good friend and brother, as he called him, Brother John O'Neill, was missing and presumed dead. At that point, when Ali was conveying in Arabic to the general as to what happened, we had a really quite emotional meeting, both the realization of this profound event, the attack of 9/11, and that someone like John O'Neill missing and presumed dead in the attack. I mean, one of the great ironies you could ever describe.
With Al-Qaeda now the single greatest threat to US national security, Yemen becomes a front line in the war on terror. Yemen's President Saleh knows that his country is a hotbed of terrorist extremism and closely associated with Al-Qaeda and Osama Bin Laden. He's in the spotlight, and America is piling on the pressure.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
President Saleh is incredibly worried about what's about to happen. He knows that Afghanistan is sort of the U.S.'s #1 target. But after that, there's a lot of loose speculation that Yemen might be next.
Very quickly, Saleh clears his schedule for a visit to the U.S. and a meeting with President Bush.
He's been clamoring for a trip to the United States. This is what he really wants, to go to have a one-on-one meeting with President Bush and explain, look, whatever you need to do, I'm here to help you. Just don't bomb Yemen.
Saleh came to Washington, met with all of the significant leaders, Director of the FBI, Secretary of Defense, Colin Powell, and then finally, President Bush himself in the Oval Office.
It was cards on the table. It was, you're either with us or against us. Saleh didn't really have much of a choice. I mean, he could have told the US he wasn't interested in their friendship, but then there'd probably been an invasion.
We spent a lot of time talking about our mutual desire to bring radicals and murderers to justice.
The two men, both very originals, had a candid discussion about Al-Qaeda and the threat, and they reached a man-to-man agreement.
And I thank the President for his strong support in this war against extremists and terrorists.
And it was on that basis, really, that we built the next 3 years of active cooperation.
Shukran. Shukran. Shukran.
Behind the smiles for the cameras, the tough realities of the US requirement from Saleh are unmistakable. At a meeting with CIA chiefs, President Saleh is handed a list of the terror suspects most wanted in his country. At the top of the list is Abu Ali al-Harati. Within hours, an order comes from President Saleh to give the USS Cole investigation back in Yemen whatever they want.
If you talk about a watershed event, there was a sea change in attitude. Any individual we need access to, unfettered interviews of card-carrying Al-Qaeda members.
But as well as orders, Yemen's president gets backup. Days after his trip to Washington, Congress authorizes a massive package of counterterrorism aid for Yemen, and taking the lead is the CIA. At the center of the package is the establishment of a training camp led by 100 special forces from the Marines, the Navy SEALs, and units from the Joint Special Operations Command.
Paramilitary operatives, contract officers working for the CIA, former Green Berets or U.S. Navy SEAL commandos, go places and do things that your standard CIA field operative is just not trained to do. They set up a base to train a Yemeni counterterrorism battalion.
The CIA's classified mission is to help Yemen's special forces find and take out as many Al-Qaeda operatives as possible. And al-Harati is the top priority. Supporting the special forces is a top-secret group of communications and CIA intelligence specialists known as the Activity. They come ready to spy on cell phone, satellite phone, and landline networks and quickly start harvesting a wealth of data for analysis in the US. On top of that, the investigation starts making the best possible use of President Saleh's increased openness and cooperation.
The Yemenis handed over to us a vast amount of information and evidence which we were then able to send to the United States for processing. So that whole investigation got a real jolt.
Now, with unfettered access to interrogate anyone they want, the CIA-led team develops a vastly richer array of new information about Al-Qaeda in Yemen.
Having access was tremendous, night in and night out. It was a veritable assembly line of reporting of useful intelligence information.
Even with this increased level of intelligence, al-Harati remains out of reach in the tribal backcountry of Yemen's empty quarter, an area as impenetrable as Tora Bora in Afghanistan. The key to locating Abu Ali al-Harati is the Yemeni president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and all eyes are on him to deliver. President Saleh takes one of the biggest gambles of his career. He decides to take on the tribes in a military confrontation to get al-Harati, and to do it with his own troops. It's something he has never dared do before, but he's determined to show he's in control and to assert his authority over the tribes.
shortly after President Saleh arrived back in Yemen, he sent out a group of Yemeni forces about 100 miles east of the capital in an attempt to capture what at the time was believed to be Abu Ali al-Harathi.
Saleh's troops are far from familiar territory and face a heavily armed opposition of experienced fighters.
There was a confrontation between the government forces and the tribal forces. And indeed, 18 Yemeni soldiers were killed in that operation. There was Yemeni blood on the ground in the attempt by Saleh to redeem his pledge from the Oval Office.
Saleh not only fails to capture al-Harathi, but shows the world he's not in control of his own country. With the president floundering, intelligence comes in that Al-Qaeda in Yemen is about to make the most of his weak grip on security and the shock created by 9/11.
Al-Harathi and the rest of them were as surprised by September 11th as the rest of us. So for them, they had no idea that Al-Qaeda was planning this. And so when it happened, then they had to reorganize. Everything that they'd known, the world had changed.
And to anticipate any counter-terrorism initiatives, Al-Harathi now starts a campaign of violence far in excess of anything ever seen before in the country.
In late 2001 and early 2002 was this organization, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, trying to reorganize, make sense of a world that had changed dramatically around them, where all of a sudden, instead of laying low, carrying out one big attack, now they're just fighting for their lives. And in doing that, they lashed out and they carried out a lot of different attacks, which at the time, I think led a lot of different analysts, both in the United States as well as in Yemen, to think that the group was much, much bigger than it actually was.
Impotent and confined largely to the cities, all Saleh's security forces can do is arrest anyone they suspect and detain them for long periods. A strategy which yields few results.
The Yemeni government has just arrested a vast number of people and thrown them all in prison in the hope that the guilty would rise to the surface and they'd be able to give the Americans some of what it is that the U.S. appeared to want.
It was very, very intense during that period. It was really a crescendo of us raising our game to try to disestablish Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda, with the flush of success from 9/11, raising their game, drive us out of Yemen and to intimidate the Yemeni government. Through that first year, it was very touch and go about which side was going to prevail.
Ever since the attack on the coal, Yemen's two main ports have been closely watched by the security services. But they've ignored a third smaller port that is occasionally used by oil tankers. And then Soufan and McFadden get intelligence that Al-Harathi is about to exploit a security weakness in Yemen's counter-terrorism strategy.
Ali had just composed an information report, an intelligence report. And in that, he talked about information we had put together that strongly indicated that a maritime attack was imminent.
2 days after Soufan's warning, and before Yemen's security forces can act, a small boat, laden with explosives, approaches a French oil tanker. The attack kills one sailor and spills thousands of barrels of oil into the sea.
When we first heard about it, we knew without any doubt whatsoever that this was the next planned attack on a ship, in this case a large French-flagged tanker.
It's a reminder of just how free Al-Qaeda is to operate in Yemen, nearly 2 years since the attack on the coal. And once again, all fingers point to Al-Harathi and his network.
The FBI was gradually, methodically accumulating evidence. The Yemeni government itself issued a white paper to the parliament during this period, which laid out a lot of the details of the terrorist activity, including the attack on the merchant vessel Limburg, the French oil tanker. And Abu Ali's fingerprints were on those operations. He had acquired and transferred the explosives, for example, for the attack on the Limburg, as he was involved in the coal attack as well. So his fingerprints were all over this plotting, and he remained at the top of our list of people that we had to deal with to protect ourselves.
But with each successive attack, the CIA are learning more and more about how its godfather, the lead terrorist Abu Ali al-Harati, operates.
We were conferring every day with the special element that was in Yemen. And they were working very hard, 24 hours a day, to establish communications procedures, using the best technology and information available to track Abu Ali al-Harati and those he was with.
The information war on Al-Qaeda in Yemen is quickly accelerating. But no one is ready for al-Harati's most dangerous plot yet. It's a hot afternoon in a suburb of Yemen's capital, Sana'a. And al-Harati is busy with preparations in a safe house for an operation on a target he's been meaning to hit for years. But then, one of his fighters accidentally triggers a rocket-propelled grenade, setting off an explosion that kills one and wounds another. The explosion alerts the Yemen police, who call on the Americans for assistance. And then, with the CIA signals specialists known as the Activity, they move in. Inside the safe house, the Activity finds a treasure trove of information left by the bombers. Laptops, cell phones, and lists of names. Crucially, they obtain a wealth of detail about the satellite phones used by the cell and its conspirators. It's as good as having the contacts book of the Godfather himself. And then they find out what Harati had been planning.
When we put the intelligence pieces together, we ultimately concluded that the target of the attack was a missile attack against the U.S. Embassy.
CIA investigators now realize that Al-Qaeda is facing a problem in its Yemen operations that plays directly into the hands of the U.S. All the planning needed for his multiple plots means far greater communication is needed, and that is giving much greater scope for surveillance.
The problem with Mr. Harati is that he loved to chat on the telephone. He was hiding out in what they call the empty quarter. Now, the problem with sat phones are that they're incredibly easy to intercept. Every time you press the talk button, it's like a giant invitation to the world's electronic eavesdroppers to listen in on what it is that you're saying.
Sat phones don't just give away what you say, but also show where you are. Because they link to satellites, they act like a GPS, and anyone with the right equipment can pick up your position.
As soon as the phone is turned on, NSA, through a series of classified technical means, can locate the person holding that phone. It's called in the business geolocation.
The National Security Agency in Fort Meade, Maryland, is now getting routine fixes on Harati's position in Yemen and feeds it to the CIA.
NSA identified Harati's telephone number and put him under 24/7 watch. It's what in the business they call cast iron coverage, meaning there's some guy listening to that telephone number 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
If the CIA can work with Yemen's army and send in a ground force or airstrike, al-Harati can be easily taken out. And then, just as investigators are closing in, Al-Harati discovers his sat phone is revealing his location, and he stops using it. No one has any idea where he is or where he'll strike next. But everyone knows it won't be long before he does. But the CIA have one certainty they can rely on. Al-Harati's radio silence puts a huge strain on his ability to organize multiple plots. And so he has to travel a great deal more to talk to his conspirators. The CIA know that to reveal his whereabouts, the terrorist only has to weaken once and resort to using his phone. And so it waits and watches, hoping Al-Harati will take a risk.
In November 2002, Al-Harati's out in the desert with several members of Al-Qaeda. They had to come and meet face-to-face to have these different meetings. They were carrying out one of these, and one of Al-Harati's phones rings, and he's been very disciplined for a very long time about not answering his phone. And for whatever reason, he answered the phone. And he immediately knew it was a mistake. He didn't stay on the phone particularly long, but he stayed on long enough for the intelligence analysts at the NSA in Fort Meade in Maryland to get a lock on him, and that was then relayed to different teams on the ground.
Harati reveals his location in a moment of carelessness. Just one call, and the NSA is locked on. Analysts in Washington quickly gather to review their options. Taking out Harati with a team of Navy SEALs or other special forces would be the preferred option.
Bouncing around in a Land Rover in the backwoods of eastern Yemen with a minimal escort, if the Yemeni government was willing to give us permission to send in a team of special forces operators, it would have been easy to eliminate his bodyguard and capture him.
But there's one big obstacle to a ground attack. The president of Yemen, Abdullah Saleh, has ruled out US forces putting boots on the ground.
The only option left to us was an airstrike. Now, President Saleh didn't want American fighter bombers flying over Yemeni airspace, which left basically an unmanned drone as the only option left to us.
Until now, an armed drone has only been used once to take out a terrorist. The decision now is to assassinate Al-Harati with the new technology, something that has never been done before in the Arab world.
There had been an executive order which allowed the use of drones to kill terrorists, effectively, and the implication was Al-Qaeda terrorists. And that had happened relatively recently.
With Al-Harati pinpointed and a presidential order in place authorizing his killing, the decision to use a drone armed with a missile is given the green light, and the CIA's well-rehearsed plan is put into action.
As soon as the order came in, a classified message went to the commander. 2 Predator drones, both armed with Hellfire missiles, were sortied from the base, took off, flew into Yemeni airspace, and just sat there and waited for NSA to tell the controllers where their target was located. The drone can fly up to 9,000, 10,000 feet in the air and just sit there, flying lazy circles in the air, waiting for your target to appear. They can stay in the air up to 25 hours at a time.
The CIA's drone operators now track the vehicle containing Al-Harati. They're assisted by Yemen special forces observing and following from a distance. With the Predator drone directly above the target, the operator releases a Hellfire missile.
The time had come to show that the US would not allow Al-Qaeda to crop up on different fronts, that if you're going to attack the United States, there were going to be consequences of that. And I think actually the attack on Abu Ali was probably a conglomeration of all of those things.
November 2002, the strike on Abu Ali al-Harathi is the first time, at least the first recorded time, that we have of the U.S. using a drone outside of a declared battlefield. So it was a very big moment, not only for the U.S. war against Al-Qaeda, because killing Abu al-Harathi sort of, cut off the head of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, but also for U.S. technology.
With al-Harathi out of action, Al-Qaeda in Yemen is left fragmented and weak.
It was a country that had had violent Islamism, including Al-Qaeda, since at least the early 90s. It goes all the way up to 2002, and then with the death of Abu Ali, it suddenly stops. It's one of the very few cases in which a drone strike did exactly what it's meant to, which is decapitate an organisation. If you take out the top of an organisation, you leave the rest of it without an authority to control it, to tell it what to do. So it just kind of crumbles in on itself and fades. In this case, it did work very well.
The CIA strike on al-Harathi is a textbook operation. It goes down in history as one of the most successful drone operations of its kind. For the next 3 years, top-secret signals technology combined with advanced intelligence gathering across the Arab world leads to operations that seize Abdul Rahim Nashri and 13 others. All are jailed. Al-Qaeda is put out of business. And Yemen is closed down as Osama Bin Laden's next place of refuge. In 1959, the CIA is confronting a new enemy, Fidel Castro, the man who threatens to spread communism across America's backyard.
The fear for the United States was that a Cuban-style revolution would explode throughout Latin America.
The US President Dwight Eisenhower wants him assassinated, and the CIA is given a job. But they need someone who can break through his tight security. Their unlikely weapon, a 19-year-old woman named Marita Lorenz.
She was the natural choice because she could get through all of the protective layers that Fidel had around him, and she could get into his bed.
This is the story of one of the most extraordinary CIA operations of them all. It will involve the mafia, a Watergate burglar, and Castro's lover.
He looked at me. Did you come to kill me?
This, the most bizarre CIA assassination attempt of them all, begins with a chance encounter that took place in the port of Cuba's capital city, Havana. A 19-year-old German-American woman named Marita Lorenz is on the deck of her father's cruise liner, the MS Berlin.
I was on board the ship. My father was sleeping. I saw this launch coming, and it was coming closer and closer. And then finally, they stood up and waved. And I saw that they all had guns and all wore green uniforms and had beards. The launch came up very close, and he just held on to the railing. He looked up, and I looked down. He said, "I'm coming up." And I said, "No." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, who are you?" And he just looked at me, and he said, "This is Comandante Fidel Castro."
Fidel Castro is the most notorious revolutionary in the world. Just 1 month earlier, at the age of 32, he seizes power in Cuba in January 1959. He overthrows an American-backed dictator and turns his people against the United States. Castro becomes Prime Minister of Cuba and forms a close economic and military alliance with the Soviet Union. Now his friendship with the Soviets and his desire to spread his communist revolution throughout Latin America is sending shockwaves back to the United States.
We didn't realize there was a threat right in the United States' backyard until it was too late and Castro had seized power. We had to focus our attention because this had the potential to become a communist base in our hemisphere.
Cuba is only 90 miles away from the American coast.
Cuba was so close to the United States and was potentially a place where missiles could be launched directly against the United States. I mean, what a strategic advantage Fidel had.
Eisenhower recognizes that Castro is a serious emerging threat to the US that needs to be dealt with. But the young Marita knows nothing about this man who's about to come on board her father's ship.
Very flirtatious, looking at my eyes, trying to size me up.
As they come together, 19-year-old Marita Lorenz is swept away by Castro's charisma.
And I saw his eyes, and that was it. Lost in love. I fell in love. And that's the first time I kissed him. And then my father stormed in. And that's that picture of me sitting at the table with the first officer and Fidel, and immediately I pulled my hand away so Papa wouldn't see.
Marita's father invites Castro to stay for dinner that evening before he takes his ship and his daughter back to New York.
I remember standing on the top deck when we pulled out of the harbor and missing him and feeling terrible. I've got to see him again.
As soon as Marita returns to the city, Fidel Castro calls and invites her back to Cuba. This is the beginning of a passionate love affair.
I hadn't even unpacked. He said, "How are you? I miss you." And with his bad English, asked me to come back. I send you airplane. And I ended up back in Havana with the same suitcase I hadn't unpacked.
A week later, Marita leaves her family's ship and moves into Castro's penthouse apartments on the 24th floor of the Havana Hilton.
I felt absolutely terrified, happy, frustrated, crazy, and defying my parents without telling them. I felt very guilty. I was taken to a suite, 2408, which linked to 2406 with doors. The first thing I remember, the smell of cigars. This is his place. I look around and there's all his uniforms and this beautiful music. It was a record that never stopped. It played over and over and over again. And boots turned upside down and ashtrays with cigars in it. And then I see toys. Little tanks. And then a bazooka sticking out from under the bed. This was where Fidel was living. And that kind of scared me a little bit, you know, but I don't have anywhere to go. Even if I tried, the whole hall was filled with bodyguards, and it was Fidel's suite. And they just said, wait, and don't go out, just wait. And I did just that. I waited, and waited, and waited. All of a sudden, I hear the door swing open. And he came in and picked me up and swung me around. And I miss you so much, you know, and love talk. And that's a moment I'll never forget.
The CIA has been looking for ways of getting to Castro, and they've just stumbled on their first big break.
He would have very close access to Fidel. Fidel, I'm sure, had very, very tight security. He would have bodyguards with him, protective detail wherever he went.
Oh, Fidel Castro, from the very beginning, enjoyed very, very good personal security. Very good. It's comparable to the best anywhere in the world. He created one of the world's best intelligence and counterintelligence organizations.
Back in Washington, CIA agents realize that 19-year-old Marita Lorenz may be exactly what they are looking for.
Here you have one of the prime targets by the U.S. government and the CIA, Fidel Castro himself. So anybody that's accompanying him, around him, or anywhere connected with him is going to be known in detail by U.S. intelligence.
The CIA realizes Marita could be a valuable asset, and they are studying her every move.
Marita had a romantic relationship with him. A romantic relationship would actually get her into his bedroom, so she would be able to bypass all of his security layers. She would be the ultimate recruitment target for the CIA and for the U.S. government. No one could track him down except for this one person who was his lover.
In April 1959, Fidel Castro is invited to the US by the Society of Newspaper Editors. Castro accepts the invitation, hoping to win over American public opinion as tensions between the two countries steadily rise. Marita accompanies him on their 11-day visit. The CIA is, of course, there too.
What the CIA would use is what's called the foreign agent recruitment cycle. And that cycle consists of first spotting a target, a person that has direct access to the person that you're after. The spotting could have very possibly occurred when Marita was either in Havana, or be a strong possibility it could occur when she traveled to the United States with Fidel and he met with Nixon.
He came to New York in anticipation of seeing President Eisenhower. And instead, Eisenhower rejected him and pushed him off to Nixon, which absolutely infuriated Fidel. He felt very angry that he wasn't accepted with open arms as the new leader of Cuba.
That would have been a prime opportunity for her to be spotted. Without question, he was meeting with Nixon. That was a high-level meeting, and you can be sure that U.S. intelligence was all over that visit. Then they would assess the person, their vulnerabilities, whether they were available for recruitment. Then they would develop that person, befriend them, find certain switches maybe that they could use. And then finally, they'd make the pitch, would you come over and work with us, and can we use you in our operation?
After 2 blissful months, Marita learns that she is pregnant with Castro's child.
I was happy to be pregnant, very happy. I wanted it. I wondered what it was going to be. He said, oh, wonderful. Half German, half Cuban. I said, and American. And he was very happy. He said, now I have to build another hospital.
But Marita realizes there are limitations to being Fidel Castro's lover.
I understood that he belonged to Cuba. He made that very clear. He belonged to everybody and to Cuba first, and to nobody but to Cuba.
By now, the US is becoming increasingly concerned by Castro's popularity.
Fidel Castro was a titanic figure. When he won power on New Year's Day in 1959, he had come down from the mountains of Cuba after a 2-year insurgency. He was the hero of the Cuban population. He was a young man, he was 32 years old, and there was an appeal, the beard and the costume that he cultivated very, very carefully, almost never being seen out of that guerrilla costume. He was admired in much of Latin America, especially among the youth, the university students, the nationalists, and of course the radical left. It was just weeks after he won power, and Fidel began very stridently attacking the United States in speeches. He did this in speech after speech. He denounced the United States.
If the Americans don't like what is happening in Cuba, they can land the Marines and then there will be 200,000 gringos dead. Even if the Yankee imperialists prepare a bloody drama for America, they will not succeed in crushing the people's struggles. They will only arouse universal hatred against themselves. And such a drama will also mark the death of their greedy and carnivorous system. It is the end of 1959, and US-Cuban relations are deteriorating rapidly.
It looked pretty clear now that Fidel was abandoning any pretense of democracy, of fair government, of human rights. He began to support violent incursions, interventions against other Latin American leaders. He was aggressively exporting the Cuban Revolution to other countries. And the thinking in Washington was becoming much more focused on, we've got to do something about this.
It is now that the US government realizes that Castro must be removed.
The CIA were highly regarded in Washington in those days, and the belief was that covert action against Castro was the best instrument to use.
What happens next is a bizarre and strange mystery, but one that eventually leads to Marita being put in contact with the CIA. Marita is alone in Castro's penthouse apartments in the Havana Hilton. The birth of their child is predicted for the beginning of December, and Marita has just ordered her room service breakfast.
Everything was fine. Getting big, getting ready for the baby. I had ordered breakfast, and I drank the milk. I felt dizzy. I said, well, maybe this is just because of the pregnancy. But no. All I remember was falling backwards on the bed, and I was out. And then I woke up in a car, and I was being driven somewhere. I was like half asleep, and then I was out.
Marita's memory of what happens next is very hazy. She has glimpses of events that she can only partially recall.
The next thing I remember is lights, a light above me, and arguing back and forth, cursing in Spanish. They were arguing about Fidel. I don't know if they're arguing at him or with him or against him or for him or what. I couldn't make it out. And I don't know if my clothes were on or off, or somebody's moving my body back and forth.
Marita is 7.5 months pregnant and senses that something shocking is happening to her baby.
Terrible pain, terrible pain. But I was like half gone. I thought the baby was born. For a moment, I heard a baby cry. I had a needle in my arm, and the pain was unbearable, and I felt wet. It made me frightened, and I started to cry, and that's all I remember. And then I woke up back in my suite.
Marita is so ill, one of Castro's aides arranges for her to fly back to New York for urgent medical treatment. FBI agents are there as her plane touches down.
The FBI met me at the airport, and I went straight to Roosevelt Hospital under FBI protection, surrounded by them.
Unbeknown to Marita, this is the beginning of her involvement with the CIA plot to kill Castro. After a forced abortion, performed when she was drugged and kidnapped from Castro's residence, Marita is now suffering from blood poisoning and requires immediate surgery. And she's about to find out what has really happened to her.
It is apparent that she underwent a forced abortion in Havana. And then the question would be, was that done by the Cuban government? Was that done by the US government or the CIA? And based on my knowledge of the kind of operations that happened back then, personally, I don't think the CIA would have done that. It would be my opinion, perhaps, that Castro himself may have been behind that. He had several lovers, and it's very possible that Marita was not the only one. And if a child was born, it could have caused him possibly some political ramifications.
The CIA agents begin to use the abortion as a way to turn her against Castro.
If Castro was behind this forced abortion, then that would be the ultimate development tool to use with Marita, because that would be a classic betrayal, not just by her romantic lover, but also the loss of her child caused by Fidel Castro.
The CIA now initiates its plan to turn Marita into their assassin.
The next step in the recruitment cycle is called development. And at that point, they would approach Marita and begin developing her.
First, the CIA agents play the good cop and try to win her confidence.
After the hospital stay, I was allowed to go home under 24-hour guard and recover physically and mentally and emotionally. Had the agents around me every day giving me so-called vitamins. And they took turns watching me day and night and day and night.
The agency would now know the vulnerabilities that Marita had after the assessment, and to develop her, they would begin appealing to those vulnerabilities.
I was heartbroken. I was sad. I was lonely.
She was betrayed. She had an abortion, a child that obviously she loved and wanted to keep. She was emotionally traumatized. She wound up in a U.S. hospital alone. So they'd begin appealing to that.
They started this program of, let's get even with him. He did this to you. Let's get even with him.
He didn't do anything about it, left her in the cold. So he wasn't the person that she thought he was.
I was 19. I was very naive when it came to matters of politics or international foreign policy affairs or love affairs.
They're going to try to convince her that the United States is the good guy and Fidel Castro is the bad guy.
They repeated things over and over and over again about Fidel doing this, Fidel that, Fidel this. I would have these crying jags where I would curl up into a ball and cry my eyes out and wanting the baby and throwing things, you know, and they would give me pills to calm me down. They would say that's the anger coming out and you have to do something to get rid of that anger, you know.
Before the CIA agents can go any further with Marita, they need to know that she has been telling them the truth about her past.
The next very important step is you have to vet the person, the target. It's critically important because we've had many times, many cases where a person has come over and they've become a double agent or were a double agent. So to vet, in this case, Marita, the agency would have to corroborate all the information she provided. Her trips back to Havana, all her records would be checked, her travel records, the people that knew her over there, if we had access to them, and the procedure would not proceed forward until the agency was absolutely convinced that the information she was providing was credible.
Having worked on her personal relationship with Castro, planting the seed that he is the bad guy, they now need to get her on their side politically. The CIA agents begin to dig deeper into Marita's past. Marita tells them she was born in Germany on the 18th of August 1939. And 2 weeks later, her country invaded Poland.
I'm a child of the war. All I remember was hard times.
The agents learn that her father, Heinrich, was a German submarine captain. Marita informs them that her mother, Alice, was a spy for both the French resistance and the British intelligence during World War II.
My first memories of her were in the basement where she would do Morse code, da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
She tells them that in 1944 her mother's cover was blown and that she was thrown into the Nazi German Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Marita, then only 5 years old, accompanied her there.
I was incarcerated in an SS home and then transferred to Belsen.
At the end of the war in 1945, the Belsen concentration camp was liberated, and Marita says she was finally rescued.
It was this British ambulance driver that found me half dead under a bunk in Belsen and pulled me out.
In 1950, the family moves to the United States, settling eventually in New York, and life begins to improve for Marita. The story of Marita's brutal childhood in Germany allows the CIA agents to play on her loyalty to her new country, the country that's made her happy, and the country that Castro is now threatening to destroy. Planting the seed that Castro is the bad guy in their relationship, they now broaden their approach to include his hatred of America.
They'd bring out the information such as Castro was determined on invading the United States, overturning the U.S. government. He was a bad guy. He was affiliated with the Russians. He hadn't told her any of that information. She didn't know any of that.
You didn't know that? No, you're too dumb, too blind, you know? They would curse at me. They would keep me in the room. They wouldn't open the window. I wouldn't go out. They would just bring food, and I felt confined. And all they ever talked about, look, here's more proof. See, he's a commie. He's nothing but a damn commie. And you have to do something.
Having now softened Marita up, the agents come clean and ask her to join them.
The final step in the recruitment process would be the pitch. And that's when you actually ask the person to come over and work for the CIA, U.S. intelligence, and ultimately the U.S. government.
The CIA said to me, now you can work for us.
After weeks of developing Marita, she agrees to join them. Only now do the CIA agents finally disclose the real purpose of their mission.
We want you to take him out. And I said, you what? Are you trying to tell me to kill him? And they said, well, we don't use those words. It's just kind of neutralizing him. Look, can you just put something in his food and put him to sleep? You would never know, and you would leave. I said, I can't kill him.
The CIA now ramp up the horror of a world under Castro's control and try to explain to Marita that the future of the United States is at stake.
They would have to have her so convinced that Castro had absolutely betrayed her, that his sole aim was to invade the United States and overturn the U.S. government, that the lives of millions of American people were at stake, that the U.S. Constitution was at stake, and possibly a nuclear war was at stake, and she was one of the only ones that could stop that.
And I started to believe them. You're going to be a good citizen, and I wanted to be good. I didn't want to be bad.
You have to do this. You have to do this not just for you and your freedom, but for the United States and the people in the United States.
90 miles away, you know, that's how close he is. You could almost walk there, you could jump a puddle, you know. That's how close he is. Just think of it, Rita. You will save this country from the evils of communism. And how proud my mother would be, and how proud we would be. And I would have a star in the CIA building in Langley.
Eventually, it seems the CIA tactics have worked.
They slowly convinced me, and I said, well, maybe they weren't all that wrong. If Fidel's unpredictable, you could push that button. If I went ahead and just slipped him something to go to sleep, I would prevent an invasion. And then I thought, I have to go back and kill him.
Towards the end of December 1959, the CIA needs to be sure that she's a willing agent, so they send her back to Cuba. Marita enters the country as an American tourist, but her real task is to gauge how Castro will react to seeing his lover after 6 weeks recuperating in New York.
They wanted me to not be absent too long from Fidel. They didn't want him to think that I had become a turncoat and working for them now.
If Marita was sent by the agency back to Havana, that would be a vetting process. Obviously, if she was a double agent or if she had provided false information and went back to Havana, she would stay there.
I had the keys to the suite, room 2408, and I could just walk in and walk out. And the toys are still there, the music is still there, the boots are still there, his clothes are still in the closet.
So if she went there and she behaved the way that her handlers in the U.S. had told her to do, did the things that they told her to do, and then if she came back, then that would be a very, very good indication that she was indeed now properly assessed and recruited.
Marita passes the test. The CIA now prepares the assassination plan. At the beginning of January 1960, the CIA instructs Marita to travel to Miami to meet a man called Frank Sturgis. A former US Marine, Sturgis fights alongside Fidel Castro in the 1950s and becomes his chief of Air Force intelligence. But when Sturgis realizes the direction Castro's revolution is heading, he changes sides, and now he's working for the CIA.
Some people in the press call him a real-life James Bond, and he certainly was. He used over 30 different aliases in his career as a spy and as an assassin. I lived with Frank for a year in Miami when I was in college. He had a whole drawer full of phony IDs. I mean, some of them were from South American countries. I mean, the man was clearly, he was a man of action. He didn't just sit around and talk about his beliefs. He firmly and deeply believed in the freedoms that we have here in the United States and didn't like communism. He didn't like the total control of the individual's life and took a stand against those things and basically waged a war against Fidel Castro. When Marita Lorenz met with Frank Sturgis in January of 1960 to proceed with this plot to assassinate Fidel Castro, Frank at that point was working hand in hand with the CIA in an attempt to overthrow the Fidel Castro government. He told me that Marita was a very intelligent, beautiful, secure 19, 20-year-old woman. He was very impressed with her and in terms of her maturity for her young age. She basically was thrust onto a kind of a world stage in terms of the relationship she had with Fidel.
Sturgis's job is to come up with a suitable murder weapon for Marita to use against Castro. Should it be a gun? A knife? Eventually, he decides on poison pills. To get hold of the poison, Sturgis turns to an unlikely source to obtain it.
When Frank Sturgis told me the story, I said, poison, where do you come up with poison, Frank? And he looked at me and said, well, I got him from some friends. And I said, friends? He said, let's just say close family of friends. And of course I knew he was talking about the mafia.
The thought that the CIA working with the mafia is not such a far-fetched idea. The mob had controlled much of Cuba's gambling interests for 50 years. But when Castro came to power, he kicked them out. The mob knows that if Castro is taken out, they can move back in.
The mafia and the CIA had a community of interest in terms of getting rid of Fidel. And so I think all those things kind of gelled together in this particular plot.
It is clear, and there is documented evidence, that between 1960 and 1965, the CIA did approach the mafia to obtain the poison pills to use against specifically Castro. The reason that they would do that, obviously, is the mafia could get these poisons illegally, which the United States could not do, or even the CIA officers would prefer not to do.
Sturgis gives Marita the pills containing botulism toxin. The weapon is very carefully chosen. They are not traceable. They would dissolve completely and invisibly in liquid. There will be no odor or taste. Critically, they will be easy to use for someone emotionally involved, because the death will not be unpleasant.
They would portray to her that, look, this is a very easy way to go. You're not going to be pulling a trigger on a gun. There's no violence in this, and it's a merciful way to do it, to use poison. Really, this is the most painless, soft way to do it. Castro won't suffer at all.
The CIA has got their agent and their murder weapon. All that is left now is to set their assassin in motion. The problem now facing the CIA is that Castro has no routine, no set pattern, which drives the agents wild with frustration. He is in Havana 1 minute, then across the other side of the island the next. Even his closest associates have little idea where he will be spending the night.
He had no hours, he had no timing. Nobody could make an appointment with him. He was always 6 or 8 hours late. His watches meant nothing. He would come and go as he pleased and he wished. Nobody ever knew what he was going to do.
He was a pretty hard target, so they would have to find out a routine, a habit, something that would occur pretty regularly so they could have things set up to occur at that time or that place.
Eventually, CIA agents spot a pattern. Castro gives regular public television broadcasts to tell his people how they are all benefiting from the revolution. The CIA agents discover that whenever he is going to make a live television speech, he stays at his penthouse in the Havana Hilton. Just after New Year, the CIA sends Marita back to Havana to assassinate Castro. She is told they have intelligence that he will be at the penthouse that night.
This was one of the most tense times in U.S. history in terms of intelligence and military involvement in the Cold War, our relationship with Russia and their connection to Cuba. So this operation would have been of utmost importance to the CIA and to the U.S. government.
I was in the plane. I was gonna go to kill Fidel, you know. The pills made me nervous.
Marita, terrified she will be stopped going through customs, decides on an extra precaution to try and conceal the poison pills.
I went into the bathroom and I put them in a cold cream jar. And I felt better. I felt I'd be okay going through customs.
The 90-mile trip from Miami to Havana takes about 30 minutes. Marita makes it through customs unchecked. It seems her trick with the cold cream has worked. Marita now heads to the Havana Hilton and Fidel Castro's penthouse suite.
I felt important. I almost felt like I was in a grasp that I couldn't get out of, and that I was going to be saving American lives if I took this one life. I walked right in and snuck in the bathroom, closed the door, hoping Fidel didn't walk in right now. I was nervous because I have this man's life in my hands, all because of these little tiny pills. My heart was crying. Oh God, I was absolutely scared.
Marita's mission is to place the poison pills in Castro's drink to assassinate him. But they are covered in cold cream, which is sticking to the pills like glue.
I tried to wipe the cold cream off the pills. Oh! I was panicking. My God, there was no way I could grasp the pills.
Marita now desperately tries to abort the mission.
And I just took them like that and they wouldn't go down, and they kept floating. I was panicking. I thought I heard the door, and Fidel was coming in. I kept pushing the lever down, and one went down, and the other one didn't. And I smelled like cold cream, and Fidel walks in. I said, Fidel, I love you, I'm back. I'm gonna stay, this and that, you know. He lay down on the bed like nothing. He said, you're back. What you been up to, hanging around those Miami people? And when he said that, oh my God, he knows. He knows. And he just looked at me and shook his head. And then he just took off the gun belt and threw it over the lamp. And he took the gun out of the holster. I thought that he's gonna shoot me. But then he flipped it around and he gave it to me. He looked at me. He said, "Did you come to kill me?" He left himself wide open, vulnerable. He turned to his side, you know, like she's got the gun in her hand. What is she gonna do? Who is she really? He was, for a split second, a little nervous. And then he just took a puff of smoke on a cigar and closed his eyes. He said, "Nobody can kill me. Nunca. Nobody ever can kill me." I ejected the magazine out of the gun, and then I put the gun back in the holster, and then he said, "Come here." And that was the end of that. I could have killed him, but I didn't kill him. I went to bed with him. He took the phone off the hook. I was so relieved about the pills. I was even afraid that my makeup case would come walking out of the bathroom. But I made love to him. And it was as beautiful as ever, but something was missing. And that was the baby.
On the same evening, Marita flies back to Miami and tells the CIA she has failed to kill Castro.
Frank felt that Marita lost her nerve on this particular assignment, mainly because of her feelings about Fidel. The old emotions, if you will, took over, and she just wasn't willing to take the step to actually to end his life.
You know, the CIA is not always successful in what it does, and it has failed a number of times. We never know about that because it's an enclosed, secret world. So failure is something that the CIA is used to. So if Marita was not successful in her operation, the agency would just move on to the next plan. That's exactly what they did.
Marita's failure causes the CIA to realize they will need to continue exploring ways to get to Castro. Marita's was the first assassination attempt on Castro's life, and is the closest anyone has managed to get to him. Since then, there's been an estimated 638 plots to kill Castro, ranging from an all-out invasion to exploding cigars, poisoned pens, and sniper attacks. All have failed, and Castro, who steps down in 2008 as one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, is still alive today.
He's survived quite a few assassination attempts. Only a few of them were sponsored by the American government. Many others were sponsored by Cuban exiles who were violently opposed to the Castro government. Fidel survived because he created a very powerful and thoroughly ruthless machine for internal security. He was absolutely ruthless. Whenever he even had a scent of opposition, whether it was a group of Cubans somewhere on the island or some prominent individual in the Cuban leadership, even a hint of opposition was enough to result in that person's political extermination and possibly even their execution.
The year after Frank Sturgis gave Marita the poison pills, he helped plan the CIA-funded Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba to overthrow the Castro government. He was later arrested as one of the Watergate burglars, sent by President Richard Nixon to break into the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington. Sturgis was imprisoned for 13 months. As for Marita, she continued to work against the Castro government, and during a fundraising mission met another dictator, former president of Venezuela, Marcos Pérez Jiménez. Marita fell in love with Pérez. They had a daughter and a brief affair, and then he was imprisoned on charges of embezzling $200 million. In 2000, Marita returned to Havana in the hope of meeting with Fidel Castro again, but he refused to see her. Today, she is still living in New York.